We're a community where news and information is created by our team of journalists. We ask tough questions and we simplify the science so that anyone can understand. We don't only cover disease, but delve into the latest research on what it takes to keep our brains healthy. Aside from the experts, we also interview people diagnosed with dementia. Being Patient Perspectives looks at that first-person perspective of people living with dementia.
Okay, we're live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Being Patient's live talk. And this is Nicholas Chan, reporter with Being Patient. And today we'll be speaking with Steph Jagger, author of the forthcoming book, Everything Left to Remember, My Mother, Our Memories, and a Journey Through the Rocky Mountains. And we'll be speaking with Steph about her mother, Sheila Jagger's Alzheimer's diagnosis in 2015. And she'll talk about their adventure to the wilderness and all the national parks that they visited 11 months after her mother's diagnosis, and what Steph learned from her mother, from Mother Nature, and from her mother's Alzheimer's diagnosis. So Steph, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm so delighted to be here, with you, Nicholas, and also with the community of people that you've gathered on Facebook. Hi, everybody.
So Steph, let's start. And I was wondering, what really inspired you to write the book, and what do you hope people can really take away from this book?
Mm-hmm. I think more than what inspired me to write the book, I think about all of the different things that I've chosen to do in my life, writing books in various different aspects. And it almost felt more like a calling than it did an inspiration. And by that, I mean that it wouldn't leave me alone. The idea of writing the book. And when I took it to my mom in the early days and asked her on a walk one day what she thought about me writing her book, which was, well on in her journey in Alzheimer's, I won't go into the whole story because that's inside of the book, but there was a point where she basically kind of said, you write it, I'll walk it. And this is what you were made to do. So it felt both like a calling and also very much like permission from her that it was an important story to tell. And I forget your second question. You had a second part of that. What inspired me to write it, and what I want people to take away. Oh gosh. I think probably two things. I really would love people to be able to take away, find themselves in the book, whether that means that they find some resonance with their own story if they know somebody or have Alzheimer's and dementia within, their family or their lives in some way. And perhaps to, find some resonance or some solace within that. I think even beyond that, for anybody who has a mother, I think we're living in a world, and have been for a handful of different years, that's full of a lot of chaos and a lot of unknown. And I think there's a takeaway in the book that, is something like, we're all going to be okay. That was one lesson that I had from my mother growing up. Whenever I was kind of in her presence as a little one, that was a feeling I would feel. And I think she comes through in that book as a way of saying that even in the midst of something as horrific as having Alzheimer's and dementia inside of a family, we're all going to be okay. And I hope that's a takeaway. Yeah.
Right. And, on that note of, one of the lessons that you've learned from your mom, and in the book, you mentioned that one of the big lessons that you've learned from your mom and from nature, and also from Alzheimer's, is the lesson of surrendering. Tell me a little bit more about, what does that mean? What is that lesson that you really learned in surrendering? What does that mean to you?
Yeah. I think to kind of back it up, to go to how I got to the place of kind of understanding that it was surrender that needed to be learned, was first of all with my mom in general in our relationship, and also my experiences in nature, and then having the combination of the two. I think I spent a lot of time as a young woman, and certainly at the beginning stages of Alzheimer's, which include, a lot of various different types of grief. I spent a lot of time attempting to control what was going on. If my mom would forget a detail, or she would get something wrong, quote unquote, I think my automatic go-to was to correct her and say no, and really to kind of control the narrative of what was going on, to control all of the different emotions that I was feeling, which were very uncomfortable. And I think that's a pretty natural thing to want to do when there's something that makes you feel so out of control.
Yeah.
That's also when you venture into nature, it can be a bit of I don't know what's going to happen. It can be a little bit of a scary place. And so I think there's a similar and mirrored message is, if you feel, this is for me, if I feel that I need to step in and control something, that's probably a sign for me personally that there's a lesson in surrender and holding space, that perhaps something larger, a larger story, something more important, a bigger energy would like to reveal itself. And if I can loosen my grip on control on the different reins that I believe I have in my hands, then I might have the opportunity to learn something. Mm. And that's been certainly a lesson through my mother and Mother Nature, and certainly a part of this book as well.
Right. So to surrender, in other words, is in a way to let go. Right.
Yeah, I think for me, it's a lot about letting go and releasing control, and starting to get, instead of trying to control the chaos, becoming more and more comfortable existing within it. Is that idea of, I'm going to surrender to the fact that it might be messy and it might be unknown. I'm going to let go of my attempt to control it or make it make more sense, and kind of surrender to what is, so I can really start to see the beauty that is in front of me in the various lessons presenting themselves.
Got it. And before we talk a little bit more about your big camping journey with your mom after her diagnosis, just want to talk to you a little bit about the early symptoms of your mother's diagnosis. And it was around 2012 that you started noticing symptoms of Alzheimer's in your mom, and you weren't living with her.
That's right. Yeah.
And can you tell us a little bit about what were some of these early signs and symptoms?
Yeah. I mean, lots of people within this community know that Alzheimer's and dementia can present differently in different people, but for my mother, some of the very early signs were simple forgetfulness. And what I mean by that is words, not being able to place certain words, losing people's names, not remembering details of very short-term memory, what we did the day prior, stuff like that. And in combination with those, I started to notice what I would call kind of early coping skills. She got very good at saying phrases like, "Oh, I knew that," that type of thing, or saying, instead of saying somebody's name, she would say, "Oh, sweet person, come over here," that type of thing. So the combination of those were some of the early signs. And then I think I had a bit of a unique perspective because I wasn't living with her. I would come home every, 3, 4, or 5 months and notice more dramatic differences than I think one would if they were living with somebody day to day and there was a really slow decline happening. And so one of the tipping points for me in regards to early signs, was a change in personality that showed she had kind of lost her filter. She said something to me one day that made me quite mad. And as I was reflecting upon it, I stopped myself and thought, that's not my mother. That's not how, I know her. That's not how she would normally react. And I kind of looked backwards and connected the dots with all the other things I was seeing and went, okay, there's something really going on here. And from that stage, kind of reached out to a handful of other family members to ask, are you also noticing these things? Yeah.
Right. Like she just wasn't really like herself, right? Like things seem a little different than before.
That's right. Yeah. And again, I would really describe it as a lack of filter. My mom was a very measured person. You know, she didn't use a lot of words. She wasn't a very outspoken person, but when she did speak, it was intentional and it was kind, and it was just, she was measured in the way that she spoke. And this one occasion, she said something that was quite flippant and quite it wasn't mean, but it was quite flippant, just not thought through. And I just was reflecting on it and thinking that just wasn't her.
Yeah. And around at the same time, your grandmother, so your mother's mother, was also going, she had dementia as well, right?
That's right.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and what was like your mother's role in the care for her mother then?
Yeah, that was really excruciating. So my maternal grandmother, my mother's mother, had old age dementia and Alzheimer's. So she lived on her own into her 90s, but probably started showing some signs of dementia in her late 80s, and was then moved into a care facility in her 90s and lived her life out there. My mother, as well as her sisters, were all, they weren't hands-on caretakers with their mother, with my grandmother, but they were there at her place almost daily. They would kind of rotate to make sure there were groceries, to make sure the dog was walked, to make sure that the bills were being paid and checks being signed and various different things. So they stepped in as kind of a team to make sure that her life was still functional. And then my grandmother ended up passing in January of 2015. So my mother had been showing signs already for, 3-ish years until that point. And then my mother was diagnosed in June of 2015, so about 6 months after. And I think part of the hesitancy to go and see if something was going on, if there was a cognitive decline happening, and to kind of measure that or get a sense of that early, was because she was witnessing it in her mother. And I just can't think of anything more excruciating than seeing live the path that you are probably going to walk down and are already a ways down. And thinking that the family, if you get a diagnosis early, that the family will then be caretaking for both people at the same time. And so I think that was probably one of the reasons that my mother was very hesitant to go and see if there was that cognitive decline happening earlier.
So yeah, and so it was in June of 2015 that your mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and one of the things that struck me in the book is, you mentioned that, the family was really not well prepared for the tough conversations around Alzheimer's, and that, you mentioned that, everyone experiences their own unique loss.
Yes.
Yeah. The thing is, when we become, so focused in our own unique loss, that we lose sight of other people's unique losses as well, right? Can you tell me, tell us about how that was going on in your family, and like how were you able to open your eyes to unique losses that each of your family members were going through?
Yeah. I'm not going to be able to say who the quote is by. It's in the book. It's one of the epigraphs, but I do remember the quote, which is, "The worst loss is always your own." And I think when we have that sense of grief and we have that sense of loss, our vision really does kind of shrink, and we put blinders on, because it's almost too much to think about, what's going on outside of that. And so I think a couple of things helped with that. Number one, I read a book about loss and grief called Modern Loss. It's a collection of essays. And one of them focused specifically on, I think they called it collateral grief. It is the grief that you experience, say, of the loss of the person in front of you. So the grief that I have over the loss of my mother is my own direct grief. There's collateral grief that happens in a situation like, because of the loss of my mom, my dad is going to be consumed with caregiving for, 1 to 7 years. And because he's consumed with that, I will also lose a specific part of my relationship with him. And so there's collateral grief there. So when I read about that, it really opened me up to like, oh, there's different types of grief going on within myself. I wonder if that means there's different types of grief going on in other people. And, yes, the answer is fairly obvious. And so once that happened, it's not, I don't know that I do this with a lot of grace, but I attempt to, is to create space for the idea that other people are losing something distinctly different, sometimes the same, but also distinctly different than you. As an example, I'm the only child of my parents who doesn't have their own children. And so I'm dealing with the grief of the loss of my mother, but I'm not dealing with the grief of the loss of my children's grandmother, right? Whereas my siblings who all have children are dealing with their grief and the grief of the loss of their children's grandmother. So it kind of opened me up to that. And as I said before, like, I don't know if I'd always do this with a lot of grace, because sometimes your own grief can be consuming. But I think there is an attempt to acknowledge and create space for the idea that somebody else might be experiencing grief in a different way. The other thing that I'll add to that really quickly is that a dear friend of mine gave me a piece of advice. She's a woman who is in her 60s and is twice widowed. And she taught me a lot about what it was to lose a spouse, and to really be what she called the mourner in chief. She was the closest relationship to, not the only one, and certainly there are different ones, but that relationship she felt should be respected in a bit of a different way. And so that really helped me frame up the kind of spaciousness and grace that I wanted to offer my father as he took on the role of quote unquote mourner in chief. Yeah.
Right. So like just recognizing the fact that, different people will grieve differently.
That's right.
Open up the way for more empathy, maybe when we're with our family members, right?
Yes, I think so. And friends as well. My mother and her series of friends, they have their own unique loss as well. But yeah, I think to open that up and create a space of empathy is really important.
Right. And there's another instance in your book that I wanted to ask you about, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that, it was the morning of you taking your flight to your camping, to your adventure.
Yeah.
You and your mom woke up, you said good morning, and your mom, you said good morning and you said, I love you, Mom. And your mom just said, thank you. And then she said, I love you too, but really as a matter of factly, in a tone that's very as a matter of fact. As a daughter, how do you really make sense of that, and how do you cope with that? That's that a daughter like yourself isn't very used to hearing, right?
Yeah. And the situation was really, we were at the top of the staircase in our family home, and I said, morning, Mom, I love you. And she looked at me like, I think I know who you are, but I don't know who you are, but you've just said that you love me, so I probably love you too. And so you could sense there was a bit of a calculation going on. And she said, like, I love you too. Like, this is what I'm supposed to say, but I don't really know why I'm saying this. And, that kind of situation, as well as I think for many people, the first time or the first handful of times where a loved one forgets your name, I think those can be really, really excruciating moments in our journey within Alzheimer's and dementia. And I think this goes back to your brilliant question, Nicholas, about surrender. If my mother is going to be forgetting who I am or forgetting why she loves me, am I going to try and cling to that and do something like quiz her or tell her? I could have stood at the top of the stairs and said, oh, Mom, the reason you love me is I'm your daughter. I was born at XYZ. We've had all of these memories together. I could have tried to instill my reality on her shifting reality, or I could surrender to that. And I think for me, the ultimate question was, I need to surrender to the fact that my mother is no longer going to be able to mirror to me my own identity in the world. And I need to allow her to go on that journey and lose those memories and lose that ability to reflect my identity back to me. And part of the grieving process for me is going to be grieving that. And then I have to do the work of reflecting my identity back to myself. You know, do I love myself? Do I know my name? Do I have people around me who can begin to kind of pick up the mirror that she's kind of quote unquote metaphorically placed on the ground? And I think that was an important part of the process, and really, really speaks to the example of what I mean by surrender. As her reality begins to shift over time, will I let it? Or will I cling painfully to the reality that I want, as opposed to the one that's actually in front of me?
Right.
Yeah.
And, I think that's a point that, so many folks have, echoed during these live interviews is, the importance, and I often say this because I love it so much, is, the importance of really stepping into your loved one's reality, because reality, for them it's a shifting reality, as you say, and it's about, how we adapt to that reality instead of, clinging on to what we think their reality should be. Right.
Yes, and I actually think we're primed up to do that inside of the Alzheimer's community in a better way than we ever have been. I think because of what we've all been through in this global pandemic over the last handful of years, is reality has shifted in many, many different ways. And we've managed, for the most part, to do a lot of moving within it. We've had to learn that skill. And I think that's a transferable skill to be able to apply then to other people. It could be Alzheimer's and dementia. It could be different diagnoses of going, oh, right, I understand how this works. Reality is going to shift, and it might be painful and there might be grief involved, but it's probably going to be easier if I attempt to allow it to do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Got it. And yeah, let's get to the heart of it then, Steph. Why did you, how did you decide to go on, this, was it a 14-day trip, right?
Yeah.
14 days. Yeah. How did you decide to do that, right after your mom's diagnosis? Because,
Yeah.
I mean, traveling and doing a big trip like this with someone who has dementia, obviously can have lots of challenges.
Yeah. Well, a couple of different things. I think it goes back again to one of your earlier questions of, what inspired you to do the trip. So much of it felt like a calling. I had just been traveling in a similar area just outside of Yellowstone in Montana. And I got back from that trip, and it kind of hit me like out of the blue, you're supposed to go back. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Who am I supposed to go with? And I just, again, there was kind of almost a voice that was like, take your mom. And I went, that's strange, because one, we haven't traveled together very much. Two, as you said, that's a pretty big undertaking. But it just felt right. And it felt also, like it was perfect timing. My mother was always a very physically active person. And so she still had a lot of her physical fitness as well as balance. Her depth perception was still accurate, those types of things. So I knew physically she was going to be capable of, trail walking and going horseback riding and various different things that we did. And I knew that there was going to be only a short window for that. And I also knew that even though she was fairly far advanced, she could still hold a conversation. She still, most of what had gone was really short-term memory, as well as like the day-to-day stuff, as well as a little bit of filter. And so I thought, well, this actually might be a nice opportunity to talk to her without a filter. I mean, who doesn't want to do that sometimes with, well, maybe a lot of people don't, but I thought it might be a unique opportunity to get to know her in a way that I hadn't been able to in our previous relationship. And I think both of those things really, really served our time together. And that's what I would say to anybody who's wanting to travel with somebody who has dementia is, it doesn't really matter if they don't remember what you did the day prior. Did they enjoy it? Did they feel good? Did they experience joy? Like, that's the emotion and the energy that's going to carry through, as opposed to, did we go bike riding or did we go horseback riding?
Right.
Don't remember. Yeah.
Got it. And yeah, can you run us through, just briefly, you guys, the two of you traveled to lots of different cool places. Can you just run us through, the trip and some of the exciting places that you went to?
Yeah. So we were on the road for about 2 weeks. We flew from Vancouver, Canada into Bozeman, Montana, and rented a car there. And from there, we basically did a really big circle and loop through 3 different states and 3 different national parks. We started, as I said, in Yellowstone National Park. We went to Grand Teton National Park and Glacier National Park. And sometimes we mostly camped. On occasion, I think there was one Airbnb and one hotel kind of on our last night. And we went horseback riding a couple of times, and we went, on a gentle whitewater raft, and we did a lot of walking and hiking and different activities in the different national parks. And it was beautiful. And that was probably one of the other reasons that I chose that trip, or that it felt right, is my mother's always been a very physically fit and athletic person, and probably more so than my father, really loved the outdoors, but they didn't spend a lot of time in the outdoors in that way. And I thought she would love it. I just thought she would be ecstatic about being able to see bison and being able to see different streams and mountains and nature. And that was certainly the case. She really, really enjoyed being in nature. Yeah.
Right. And on your note about the bisons, right? I think that was in a horseback riding tour at the Yellowstone National Park. And you talked about seeing that herd of bison during a horseback riding, and you mentioned that there seemed to be like this silent discourse going on between your mom and the herd of bisons, and you said your mom is a bison. Can you tell us a little bit about what was that like when you saw that unfolding?
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that about being in nature with my mother that was really a great lesson to me. And you mentioned that silent discourse. My mother was fairly, as I said before, fairly measured in how she spoke and what she said. She wasn't outspoken and didn't talk a lot. And I think that was one of the places that was so beautiful for me to witness. I often felt as though she was in some silent discourse with the various places that we were in nature, the bison being one of those. And it really was a big lesson for me in, if I could, quote unquote, going back to the idea of surrender, if I could surrender all of the talking and all of the noise and all that exists in my own world and in my own head, I wonder what I could hear. I wonder what energy is available to me. And so she really served as a teacher for that, really all throughout my life. I don't know that I saw it very well, but certainly saw it clearly an example on this trip. And when it comes to the bison, I mean, these are animals that in the United States, at least, were very, very close to extinction, to eradication, to being, metaphorically and quite literally, but to being forgotten. And I think, to have come back from that, to have almost, I mean, that's about as, I think I write this in the book, it's about as close to a resurrection as one can get. And I thought, just because something is approaching extinction and approaching death and approaching that, that tipping point, there's probably something, if you look a little closer, that can be reborn, can be resurrected, and brought back to life. And so that really, when I was looking at the bison with my mother, I thought, what if her energy, what if she may be on her way out, just like the bison were, many, many years ago, but what will remain? And what if her will stay? And so, I think some of that is in many ways thrown into the book, the energy of who she is and the way that she was able to kind of sit and have these, silent discourses with the world around her, and this exchange of information in a very different way than what was my most natural way, which is to do what we're doing here and talk and talk about it. Yeah.
And, on that note of silent discourse. I think another beautiful example is on your return trip. You went back to Yellowstone, and then you and your mom went to Old Faithful, which is the famous geyser at Yellowstone. And you mentioned that all the tourists left after the geyser erupted. And then you went for the bathroom, and on your way back, you just saw your mom, alone, looking at that geyser, and that was such a beautiful and peaceful moment, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is also part of the nuance of our own humanity. Oftentimes what we think we want to see, what we think is the most important part. And so in regards to Old Faithful, the quote unquote most important part is to catch it when it erupts, and to see this water and steam kind of coming out of this geyser. And so hundreds and thousands of people, gather around to take a picture of it just as it's doing that. But to say that that's the only beautiful thing about Old Faithful would be limited. And so that was another thing that I really learned from her, again, throughout life, but certainly on this trip as well, is when the most beautiful or the most shining thing, or the thing that we think is going to be the one that we all want to watch, when that dissipates, what remains that we can be in conversation with, or beauty can be found. And I think, this speaks really well to Alzheimer's and dementia, and specifically also to the aging process, that there is much of the quote unquote shine that comes off of the penny as we age, but there's still so much to be learned, and so much beauty and so much wisdom in the sediment, in the layer upon layer of rock that's still there. And do we have the patience and the nuance and the ability to sit within what might feel like boredom, to then be able to find connection and belonging, and perhaps a sense of awe.
Right. And I think for the trip, I'm sure it required a lot of patience on your part. I think I want to get to your practical advice in terms of for people traveling, for people living with dementia. What are some of your main takeaways in terms of traveling with your mom that some of our audience might find helpful when they're traveling with their loved ones as well?
Yeah, I think traveling with and just being with in general are probably the same things, but there's a few things that stand out for me. The first really would be just to be prepared to answer the same question, over and over again. My mother would ask a specific question, forget that she'd ask it, and ask it again. So one would be just preparation for that and expectation of that. The second would be what I would call like kind of a humorous redirect. So if my mom was stuck on a particular question, eventually I would try and redirect her. And there's one example in the book where, she was asking over and over again where we were. And I decided to kind of remove the map from her hands and remove the different books she was holding in the passenger seat of the car, and just ask her if she could help me by counting red cars. And so we just did a redirect there, and that seemed to work. Then she just talked about red cars for the next hour. So it just sort of depends on the level of patience and knowing that there's going to be similar questions coming again, as well as a redirect. I think another tip, whether you're traveling or not, and this is really, really popular within and known within the Alzheimer's and dementia community, which is to borrow a skill from improv. And in the improv world, in comedy, there is something called a yes and. So there's two partners who are doing a comedic scene, and one of them offers something to go with. It's a version of their own creative reality. And in improv, the rule is to say yes and then add to that, accept the gift that this person has created, and accept their version of reality and add to it. So if my mother said something like, those clouds look like they're whipping cream animals, I would say yes, and I think they would be delicious on top of some ice cream, instead of saying, no, Mom, those are not whipping cream animals, those are clouds and they're in the sky. And it will help with a couple of different things. One, I think it makes just for a more pleasant atmosphere and more pleasant feelings and emotions and sensations within our body. And two, kind of goes to that, what we've talked about all throughout this, which is the idea of they are living in an ongoing and shifting reality, and how do we work to best go with that, right?
Yeah.
The third tip that I would give, and I don't know that I did as much of this probably looking back that I would have on the trip that we were on, which would be to be a little bit more vocal and inform people around us. So I did this on a handful of occasions, but I would have done it more, is to say to the guide on the horseback riding, my mother has memory issues, what can we do to make this easier so that I'm carrying less stress and she's carrying less stress, et cetera. So I would have probably been more open about it and informed more of the people that we were surrounded by, and recruited a little bit more help in that way.
Right.
Yeah.
Got it. So yeah, like really telling, like say, and you did this too, like say you're going, whitewater rafting or like horseback riding, like talking to the guides before the trip starts, saying that, my mom has a disability or an illness, can you, help us out and keep an eye.
Yeah, that's right. And being very upfront and clear with them, you've exactly hit this on the head. There was one instance where we went where I didn't do that, and one where I did. And the one where I did, I felt so much better, where I was able to say to the guide, the safety instructions that you've just given us, she will not remember. And so what can we do as a team to make sure that, we're all safe on the whitewater rafting? And so that was really helpful. And I would highly encourage, I think sometimes there's a stigma or a bit of shame people carry. And I just think we should probably just be upfront and open. And this is no big deal. We're just trying to enjoy the day, and she's still going to have a great time if she's paddling on a river. But what do we do to make sure everybody's safe if she is a person who's going to forget the instructions?
Right.
Yeah.
And Steph, I think one of my last questions here to close things up here is, in the book again, you mentioned that, when you and your mom went home back to Vancouver, your dad came to pick you guys up, and then afterwards, he asked, what were the highlights of the trip, and your mom couldn't recall the trip, and she just said it was wonderful, but no details. I was wondering, again, does this touch upon the theme that we talked about throughout this interview, is for you to surrender, like to surrender the fact that your mom can't recall the details of the trip, but that she enjoyed the the little moments that you and your mom, you and her shared during the trip.
Yeah. I think certainly it speaks to the idea of surrender, but also to something that I'm such a big believer in, is that so many of us believe that we live inside of, facts, that this is, the world is made up of the data and the facts, and that's how we make decisions, et cetera. But really, truly, I mean, sometimes those are really important things to have, the fact that she knows my name, or the fact that she might remember what we did on the Tuesday when we were in Montana. But really what I think makes us extraordinary as human beings is that we live inside of story and emotion. And so she may not remember the fact, but if her body, if her emotions, if her sense of self is still carrying joy about an experience that she had yesterday or 10 days ago or just a moment ago, that can create such an ease and a sense of longevity and hope for all of us. And so I think that was the surrender, is she may let go of the facts of who I am, or the experience that we had together, but it's going to be for both of us, not just her, but for me also, the somatic felt sensation memories of the joy that we experienced together. And I think that's really important. I know a lot of people, when they go, when the person that they know that has Alzheimer's is in a care facility, many people saying, well, I don't want to go visit because there's really no point. She won't remember the visit. She won't remember who I am, et cetera. I said, but they will register how you've made them feel. And if that means they carry a feeling of joy through the next 3 hours, through the next 12 hours, I really think that can make a difference for people.
Right. And I'm sure that's how you approach it now that, your mom is living in a care home in Vancouver, right? That,
Yes.
she may not remember that you came to visit her, but that, at the moment when you're there with her, that she feels what she's feeling.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And play a little Beach Boys music and she's happy.
Yeah. Got it.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Steph, is there anything you'd like to add and I haven't asked?
No, I mean, you've been so thorough and so wonderful. And just, the only other thing that I would add is just to say thank you. And, thank you for the conversation and also for, for the work that you're doing and that everyone here is doing in regards to, trying to find a way to survive and thrive within a pretty excruciating circumstance. And I have a lot of respect for that. And I just thank you. I have a lot of gratitude for that too.
Well, it's my pleasure. And for our audience, if you've missed any of this live talk, we'll have a recording of the interview on our YouTube channel, as well as a transcript on our website. And if you haven't subscribed to our newsletter yet, don't forget to subscribe on our website. Thank you all. Thanks, Steph.
Thanks, Nicholas.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. For more information on upcoming interviews, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter at beingpatient.com. That's beingpatient.com. And send us any feedback you may have, whether it's someone you want us to interview or any comment about our podcast series. You can do so by emailing info@beingpatient.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'm Deborah Kahn.